Hello and welcome to Upfront. I'm Kang Tae-ri. President Park Geun-hye and the Korean government are moving to reform the country's pension system for public officials to reduce deficits. The president says that's to be done by the end of this year, but a majority of government employees are hating this idea. What's the controversy here, and how do we move forward from here? We're going to Upfront about these questions on today's Upfront.
During a speech at the National Assembly last month, President Park emphasized the need to reform the pension system for public officials.
공무원연금 개혁이 매우 시급합니다. 연금 재정 수지 부족액이 현 정부에서만 15조 원, 다음 정부에서는 33조 원, 그 다음 정부에서는 53조 원 이상이 돼서 국민 부담은 눈덩이처럼 커질 전망입니다.
The president has asked for cooperation from public offices and the National Assembly in seeking a fundamental solution.
매년 막대한 국민 세금이 투입되어야 하는 상황을 그대로 방치할 수는 없습니다. 공무원 여러분께서 깊이 이해해 주시고 개혁에 동참해 주실 것을 호소드립니다. 공무원 연금 개혁이 금년 말까지 마무리될 수 있도록 국회 차원에서도 적극 협조해 주실 것을 당부드리겠습니다.
However, the ruling and the opposition parties have taken very different stances on the pension reform plans for public officials.
We've discussed and understand the challenges facing the current public pension system, but the opposition party has only stressed the need to establish an organization to seek public understanding without suggesting ideas for actually reforming the pension system for public officials. Their intention in wanting to establish an organization for social agreement is to delay the discussion on pension reform. From our point of view, their desire to establish a separate organization for social consultations could raise controversies.
A bill proposed by the ruling Saenuri Party cuts pension benefits for both high-income public officials and middle and low-income ones. That means the reformed pension system won't guarantee public officials an income after their retirement. As it is also difficult to expect cuts, it would be hard to stabilize the nation's financial security system. Above all, this is unfair for future generations. Future generations might face a high financial burden with a decreased amount of pension benefits, so I think the bill was a hasty decision.
The ruling and the opposition parties are at odds over which direction to take in reforming the pension system for government employees.
All right, so as always, we have a great panel of experts for this conversation. First of all, to my left, Professor Sven Hort from Seoul National University, a renowned expert in social welfare. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And our Professor Song Se-ryun from Kyunghee University for legal advice. Great to have you with us again.
Good to be here.
Welcome. And of course, our Mr. Ri Jong-soo, co-president of the Sustainable Development Global Network. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
All right, so what's the controversy? I mean, so let's first talk about what the plan entails. So the government is trying to change the existing pension system for public officials. We actually have a graph here to kick us off that summarizes the reform plans unveiled by the ruling Saenuri Party. And the gist is basically to raise the proportion of salary contributions from the current 7% to 10%. And delaying the eligible pension receiving age from the current 60 to 65, and also calling for lower entitlements by multiplying the average salaries and their years in public service by 1.25% rather than 1.9%. So basically, from the public officials' point of view, it's paying more for less benefit. The money starts coming in later than in the current system. Obviously, they're not going to like this. Professor Song, let me start off with you. So what's at the core of the controversy, basically?
There are several factors, which is not really specific to Korea. First of all, people live longer. Simply, the demographic changes has made this aging society making the pension system that we have not sustainable, because actuarial tables just does not work in this day and age. And second is that there is a financial difficulty that has been kind of common to most of the advanced countries, and Korea is not an exception. The public debt is mounting, and it's in several years the money is going to run out. So you have to do something about it. And I think that in Korea's case, the design of the pension system has not been really sophisticated to suit the needs that we have in changing society. So I think there are a number of reasons why people are looking at it, but I think the chief reasons is that we have money running out and people are living longer.
Professor Hort, do you agree with the last point that he just made, not having the sophisticated system?
Yes, it seems to be a bit unsophisticated, the whole approach to reforming the system, to say the least. And I think you have to take the pension system together into the broader picture of how the economy works. And then you have to add, apart from that, people live longer also, to have a developing economy, a future for Koreans. You also need to improve the fertility rates, and there are too few children for the future. So in that sense, you can say it's not the pensioners that are unsustainable, it's the absence of new Koreans.
Well, but then speaking of the future of the country, I mean, we're talking about trying to improve the fiscal health of this country. The ruling party is actually saying that we get to save $420 billion worth of fiscal burden in the years running up to 2080. So that's quite important.
Yes, but then you have to put the searchlight on the taxation system, how to raise money in this country. And there again, I think it's not enough sophisticated systems. Japan is at the moment into a major reform of its consumption tax system, and the Prime Minister backed down, but they have huge problem compared to Korea. I mean, the Korean problems at the moment, that's peanuts compared to the Japanese problems. So of course there is a future for Korea, but you have to work hard to reform the financial system, the state financial system. And when you take out a specific group, like the public officials, and not look at another type of public employees like the military, you just divide the Korean population and try to target one group at the time without focusing on the systems. You are still creating confrontations, I would say.
Why the different system for public officials?
For Korea specifically, I think that there has been some historical factors as well. The governments in early days did not have enough legitimacy, which means that they had to have the people on their side, so there was enough reason to treat their guys better than others. But this is not just specific to Korea. You have enough reason to say that, well, if we're going to develop this country, and if the cadre of this Mandarin system is going to be the Hauja or the leaders, then we better treat them well and better, and sometimes entails treating them in a slightly different system. That's what we have to do.
And with
I think there are two factors. One is to begin with, the government servants, their wages are way low compared to the private companies.
Right, they're not going to make big money.
Right? So in terms of giving the compensation into covering the old age, the second part is that this is my thinking. The job security as well as the pension is too good for the public officers. Then the the talented youngsters would like to join government rather than working for the creative and innovative private industry.
Right. So this relatively more generous benefits for public officials, is this a Korea-specific thing when it comes to pension system?
You see them all over the world, that there are these long-term, secure investments in public employees from the start. And this is the surprising thing, you can say here, that the government almost immediately tries to turn around the system in a very short time. That is, I think, the most provocative measure I've seen so far. There are, of course, countries that are on the brink of ruin, like Greece was for a few years ago, where you have to make very drastic changes. But otherwise, countries try to reform their system over a very long period.
What is the advanced system when it comes to differentiating the scheme?
Yeah, I mean, most of the advanced countries have a basic system which covers either those who have had a long-term relationship with the labor market or cover the total population. That's the two basic systems, you can say. And then on top of that, various groups have their specific schemes. And they are often negotiated by the representatives of these groups. Their employers, and that could be the state or the private business or even organizations of a different kind in civil society and so on and so forth. But these top-ups, you can say, they differ throughout the world and are quite country-specific, and also depending on when they have occurred in time. Because the pension system, you know, is so dependent upon the actual working of the economy, not only these prognoses and projections for 2080 or something like that, which I must say is to an insider a bit. I mean, it's actuarial, it's their job to do it, but I mean, who knows what will happen in 2080 in Pyongyang or in Seoul, I mean.
Right. So speaking of having all the sides represented or voices heard, I think that's a running theme that you bring to the studio today. Some critics say that the reform plans are a violation of the Constitution. So let's take a look at this graph here. The opposition party and the civil servant union are arguing that the plans are an infringement of property rights according to Articles 7 and 13 of the Constitution. And the opposition, the ruling party and the government are saying this is for the public good, according to Article 37 of the Constitution. And Professor Song, this is where you come in. So which side do you think has a stronger case?
The people who are saying this is unconstitutional is relying on two provisions of the Constitution. One is the status of this public servant is guaranteed by the Act, and the other is that there is, as you said, property rights. The status, they're making the connections between the status and this pension system, which is somewhat related, but I don't think there's a direct correlation between the status and also the pension scheme itself. And the other one is property right. Well, we're talking about the future income streams. So there is a question as to when the right vests, or whether the right is created at some point. Well, I guess some argument could be made for those people who have their pension amounts already decided because they have already retired or they have served a certain number of years. But even then, that's pretty tenuous, I think. There is a Supreme Court decision that says pension amount can be adjusted, although that case has more factors or facts that can go into discussions later. But at least there is a precedent that this is not an absolute amount that they need to be guarded. I think away from the constitutional argument, I think the better angle to look at it is whether this is something that people can agree on. Other countries have done it better. When we say that, they have done it with dialogues, with consensus.
Okay, and you know, there is, yes, I agree with you, there is this certainly this question of social division, the potential social division. There are two sides of fierce protest from the government workers, but at the same time we have the other side from taxpayers federation and whatnot in support of the government. Can the government do this, really push for it, when there are clearly two different sides?
Well, the government have the ultimate power of so to say, the monopoly of violence. So they have the powers, definitely. The question is if this is ruled by law or rule of law. And there is this coming back to the issue of social cohesion and the necessity to create some kind of framework for the future of both the fiscal system and the social system.
Okay.
One of the points that I will raise is that there were several attempts in terms of government to try to reform this pension system. And so when you mentioned that there is no dialogue, I think that's totally not true. There has been the dialogue, there has been discussion, but this wasn't the government initiative wasn't going anywhere.
So, I mean, there are different opinions going on here, even here in the studio. Then what's the public pulse in Korea about the idea of reforming the pension plans for government workers? Let's find out in this next report.
According to a recent survey, 70% of the public believes the pension system for public officials requires reforms.
개혁의 적정 수준은 어떨지 지난 10월 중순에 조사를
We conducted a survey on the ideal level of pension reform for public officials in October. We found that 43.8% of public officials want reforms that consider as equity in comparison to national pension. Found that 28.5% stressed a need to drastically cut pension benefits and 19.8% wanted a slight reduction in the public pension. A lot of people agree with the public pension reform when it was first suggested, but after the bill was proposed by the Century Party, many wanted to put off their decision. Most of the public said more discussions were needed on the issue.
공무원연금 개혁과 관련해서는 찬성하는 의견이 많은데요.
A lot of people agree with the need for public pension reform. Regarding the method of reform, 47.9% of people chose social consultation, and 38.6% of people wanted to follow the idea suggested by the ruling party by the end of this year. From the ruling party's point of view, it would be better to promote pension reforms by the end of this year to raise the administration's approval rating. But as a lot of public officials have opposed the reforms, more discussions and more cooperation are needed before actually promoting the reform process.
방법론적인 면에서 좀 합의를 이뤘으면 하는 그런 내용도 많은 것 같습니다.
And the fierce protest, opposition from public workers is obviously because it's a downward revision. They're paying more, getting less at a later year. So considering price fluctuations, given the reality of rising prices, do you think it's the right decision? Anybody?
Well, according to OECD report 2013 regarding the pension of the OECD as well as G20 countries, the trend is, the reform is a trend. Past the 2 decades, about 36 countries went through reform. And the outcome is, sadly, one, pay more and get less benefit is the outcome.
So that is certainly the trend,
Yeah.
Professor?
Yeah, that's the trend because people are living longer and they are also living healthier lives. So they can be public servants for another not only 5 years but probably also 10 years. So in many countries they are now working with a flexible retirement age. And then you decide actually on your own how much pension will you get out of the system, because if you retire earlier then you get less, and if you retire later you get a little bit more. And I think that's the attractive side such a system. But then I think from the government's point of view, you have to stick to what you have promised, at least for those who are on their way to retirement. I mean, you can attract, as an employer, young people, good brains, with clear rules, and saying this is probably what we can promise you in 40 years' time. But if these youngsters see that the government changed the rules from one day to another, I mean, why care about that kind of? Then I can choose another employer, of course.
Let me go back to the trend that they're paying more and getting less.
Okay.
But when we're comparing other countries with Korea, I think there has to be pointed out that Korea has some special features to it, which is, when we pointed out that the Korean civil servants are getting paid less, 10 to 15% less. And most of the countries, Western countries, are paid as much as, or even better, than the private sector countries, especially, I guess, the extreme example might be Singapore, which gets about 120% of not just small companies, but the leading companies in that country. So we have those examples. We cannot really compare those two. And also, like example like Germany, people like to see that Germany has done a good job in reforming, but the difference is that the taxpayers really finance the pension system in Germany, as far as I know, not the paid-in system like Korea does.
Okay, so I think that seems to be the underlying theme of this today's discussion, how to create that dialogue with the stakeholders, basically. Now, I want to talk about the age factor when it comes to pension schemes. So, the government and the ruling party are saying that they would like to push the eligible pension receiving age from the current 60 to 65. Is it right to delay this? I mean, that's a big question, but what do we think about that?
Well, I think that by function of people living longer, I think there is a natural tendency to see where the stopping point is. These days, people are very vivacious in their even 70s. So even in terms of whether they can still function as a worker, I think there's no question about that.
So when this overall does take place, the retirement age for public officials stays at 60, but they begin receiving the benefits at 65. There is that 5-year gap. Are we okay with it?
No. I think you have to have a transitory system, so you get perhaps increase the pension age, and they get the benefit each year over this period, and maybe half a year increase it or something like that. But of course, people have to be remunerated.
Trend of the OECD countries is that most of the countries now they are increasing the statutory retirement age to 65 or 67. So if we can do that here in Korea, that's certainly the scheme can work. And also even further, certain countries will provide incentive payment for those people who want to extend the working years. So this is personally, certainly this is not in Korean situation here, but without that sort of the provision, just not paying the pension until 65, 67 is not
Then what
workable.
about pushing that eligible pension receiving age to 70, for example, and then push the retirement age to 70 at the same time? Does that make more sense in terms of trying to improve the fiscal health of the country and keeping these government officials happy?
Yeah, I think so. In the long run,
Okay.
I mean it's of course you have to have a period of transition where people adjust to the new situation. So you can't do it overnight, I think, because then you bulldoze people, and that creates a lot of tensions and resentment.
Okay.
I think the working age and the pension starting point, they has to be absolutely synchronized. And you cannot really jump from 60 to 70. It has to be a gradual process so that people can adjust to it. But I think that the age is a big factor, especially in this country, because the poverty rate in the senior citizens in Korea is an alarming rate. It's about 45%, which is a lot higher than other countries where OECD, I think the average is under 10% or so. So in that sense, you really have to look at the pension system not just to save or to look at the health of the pension system as an economic model, but does that provide enough for people at least a certain minimum standard? And in Korean case, I think the income replacement notion, I think the rate is about early 40%, but OECD, the average is about close to 60%, 50 some odd percent, and they are progressive schemes to it. So in that sense, I think that the sophistication comes in to have a redistribution impact on the pension system, but also at the minimum provide the enough income replacement factor so that people can live afterwards.
Now let's get a change of scene really quickly and include the stakeholders in this conversation. Our team had a chance to meet with the Public Officials Union. Let's take a listen.
A bill for public pension reform proposed by the ruling Saenuri Party has raised a lot of controversies. Even 98.7% of public officials have expressed opposition to the bill. After the president urged the government to promote public pension reform by the end of this year, 158 lawmakers from the Saenuri Party proposed a bill as an official party platform. This raises questions about the separation of powers within the government. What the bill entails seems to be more disadvantageous than the national pension system. According to the bill, it is impossible to secure public officials' income after their retirement. And it is difficult to simply compare the public pension system to the national pension. The bill for public pension reform ignored the unique characteristics of the system itself. We have to continue urging the ruling party, the government, and the presidential office of Cheongwade not to unilaterally promote a reformation process. Reforms of the public pension system should be promoted through dialogue and public discussions. We want the government to establish a standard for sustainable retirement income and promote financial measures by cooperating with the public.
I think Professor Hort was talking about this earlier in the program as well, but then the rate of how much the Korean government cushions in terms of pension schemes for Koreans and public officials, it falls at around 10%, and that's much lower than other countries in OECD. So the government employee union is suggesting that the government raise its burden rate. Is this a valid argument?
It seems if you're talking about it comparatively, it's of course a valid argument that Korea can raise its efforts. If it's a valid argument, so to say, in the current economic situation, is of course another matter, because then you intervene in the workings of the economy at the moment. That's two different things, I would say.
So the government cushions about 11.2%. The rest comes from taxpayers' money. If you're not a big fan of this idea, then where do we get the money to pay all the benefits to everyone, to make everyone happy?
You need to probably construct a new tax base, and there we are into the way the institutions works here. I mean, can you really trust the public institution and see that you are getting something back from them? That is, I think, the future question for Korea.
Right. Korea has traditionally been a tax little, but then benefit little kind of country. So if we're changing that, and it seems like we are, then we have to really look at the whole aspect of it, the fiscal system itself. Because if you're just looking at the pension system, maybe we're just looking at the cost side of it. But how do we increase the the income or intake level, whether it be a tax system, but more broadly, how to vitalize the economy itself so that the income comes in better. We're focusing on this, in my mind, is kind of the narrow sector. But we have not heard from the ruling side or opposition side what the whole picture is like.
So you're saying this cannot be an isolated conversation that we can have?
No, it's a part of the big picture, and it has to be. Because if you're just looking at the pension system and reducing it, if you're focusing on it, then probably we're just raising the poverty rate beyond the 50% for the older people and the younger people too. And that's not a sound policy.
There are arguments that the current administration and the ruling party are trying to take advantage of this 2-year political window until the next elections. Not my personal take, but that's the observation out there. So, I mean, if we need to change certain things about the current scheme, then this seems to be the right time to do this. Is it a bit risky the way the government is pushing for it?
Well, this is government in terms of this is a integral part of the whole plan, especially with the innovation plan. This is one of the core issue to reform the pension plans. So therefore, in terms of reduce the deficit rate and then they use these resources for the innovation and creative economy. So this is something that government cannot give up. I mean, although there is the midterm election, we're expecting the spring of 2016, but still, this is that's why more so would like to pass this bill before this year 2014 is passed by.
And not having that political window has been one of the reasons why previous administrations have failed in terms of bringing changes to the current system. So what kind of process is necessary to revise the law, the current system?
Well, just like any other laws, the government has to put their proposal on the table, and it'll go through the National Assembly with the appropriate committees first. I think that process might be not that difficult if both parties agree, but at this point it doesn't seem like there is an agreement. And it'll be push it up to the main meeting at the National Assembly, but the hurdle at this point is that there are so many different agenda, among which is a budget agreement, which takes precedent over this, I would think. So even if it's pushed up to the main meeting, I don't know if schedule-wise it'll work out this year as the ruling party is aiming. I think there's a point where the political window that we're talking about is pretty important, because people are saying that if we cannot get this thing through, then we might have to wait about 10 years to do it. This has to be part of the dialogue with a very important member of the society. There are about a million civil servants, but with the dependents and all, we're talking about 5 million people who would get really upset at this if things don't turn around. They have to be on board with whatever the Korean agenda going forward. So the government has to manage it really carefully. I think that there is a kind of precedent. I think the French government has gone through the same thing. France had huge protests over this, but subsequently they went through a dialogue process and is considered one of the successful case of kind of working out
but
together.
It took about 10 years or something, that process.
All right. So speaking of overseas cases, the government has picked Germany and Austria as ideal role models. Why is that? What are some of the key factors behind their success in terms of overhauling their pension schemes?
I don't know the Austrian case, but the German case is, of course, related to the fact that there is a new Germany. It's unified. And they had to oversee the full workings of a long-standing historical welfare system that was built up from the 1880s and even survived, you can say, the Hitler regime. So, and they have gradually improved and adapted the system to a working economy.
What about Sweden?
It's a similar system, but it's not as dramatic because there was no unification. Finland is still Finland. The Russians took it in 1809.
Then speaking of, some of the examples overseas, you briefly mentioned the case of Greece earlier on. That's certainly a case that we don't want to model after. Can we elaborate on that case?
Well, the singular case of Greece is a system where you have a very low retirement. I think it's about 55. And I mean, also in Greece, people are now living much longer, and they haven't done anything over the years to improve. They have basically adapted to the European Union economy. That's what they did. They have favorable possibilities at the start to improve their economy, but they didn't reform their public system.
One of the unique part of the pension system in the European country, including the Greece, is very high rate of the income replacement rate. It's about 90% or 85%. That is significantly the burden on the government, the budgeting.
Yes, 95% according to a note that I actually took. Let's talk about the pension fund operations really briefly. Why the face, Professor? So which countries can be great models when it comes to pension fund operations, do you think? That's another realm, obviously.
I mean, to me, operation of funds are always a complementary measure to the pay-as-you-go system, because that is the way it works in actual reality. Money are taken out of the actually working economy and paid out to pensioners, retired people, and circulated in the economy. Even, so to say, the more prosperous the retired people are, the more money goes back to their grandchildren. And that's very important to get new workers and the system working. So we are dependent upon each other, and in such circumstances, I would say, funds are only kind of buffers that can mitigate sudden shocks in the economy. But they are not reliable for the long run. I mean, you can't build up a fund in South Korea for the integration of North Korea. I mean, you can save how much money you want, but you will probably face enormous difficulties. And that's why the German experience is so important, because they really try to develop according to the current affairs during the integration process of the East.
Okay, so now let's talk solutions. Experts from a variety of fields have suggested different solutions for a successful reform of the pension plan for government employees here in Korea. Let's take a look.
First of all, we have to merge the integration of the national pension and also civil servant pension. I think that's quite desirable. But we need the step, because probably the private sector worker might resist the integration because they have a accumulated fund, but there's a deficit. So you need the long-term plan how to merge these two systems together. But the reform direction should consider the possible future integration. That's the first thing. And the second of all, the public sector, the private sector pension level at the moment is not very high, more than 20%, about 20 years contribution, 25 years contribution. And people might live until 100. And my grandmother is 104. It's quite difficult for people. After all, you have only 20% of your previous earning. So I suggest we need to make a public pension very strong.
National Pension Fund, the repayment is only 1 million monthly. The government officials fund, they are receiving about more than $2 million. I mean 2 million won. And nevertheless, the general public is compensating for this government pension fund. So it's a nonsense. So the general public should speak out. No, we don't want our tax money to be subsidized to the government officials. That is one, I think, the quick motion that has to be done. And the other principle is don't be compromised to delaying tactic. If it is delayed because of the political schedule, we have an election in year 2016, so it may not be realized that this is the last chance.
The national pension and the pension for public officials are both public pension systems. An appropriate income replacement rate for both is about 70%. The current income replacement rate for public officials is 62.7%, which is an appropriate level, but that of the national pension is about 50%, which is quite low. If the benefits of public pension are reduced, the public should receive sufficient benefits in other areas that correspond to that reduction. That's the way to secure the basic living standard of older people.
The ruling party hasn't paid attention to the stakeholders, who are public officials that have unilaterally promoted the public pension reforms so far. That's the reason for the current controversies that we face regarding the pension reform process. Reforms will take place, so it is important to minimize conflicts. Representatives of public officials, public interest, and politicians should gather and find an ideal way to better promote the public pension reform by the first half of next year.
All right, so the Park Geun-hye administration is already entering the latter half of her term. And if conflicts, tensions arise with public officials, I mean, these are her people that she needs to work with to get her policies go through. So it could deal a fatal blow to the government. What should the government and the ruling party should consider, do you think, in terms of getting things done, in terms of overhauling pension reforms?
I think that there are two very important factors here. One, as you mentioned, the president needs these people on her side to push through this agenda. But at the same time, the pension reform is something that we have been working on for decades and have not been able to go through because of labor unions and whatnot. In doing so, the balance has to be that there has to be a reform, but in a way that it's understood by people why we're doing it and what portion is being burdened by those sectors. And I think that there has to be a broader plan to lay out that, well, this pension system is being looked at first, but there are other pension systems that will be also looked at, not just to make so that there won't be a division between people. I think that has to be a first step of the overall agenda, and going back to the discussion of the overall plan and blueprint of what kind of social democracy that we're envisioning and what kind of economic fiscal policies that needs to be in place. I think those to be talked about and has to be understood and has to be persuaded so that there won't be too much of a gap that in this, as people say, polarized society.
Yeah, with that, I also strongly suggest the government should open books. Means that how they operate so far this fund, pension fund, in terms of what had been the operation cost of pension fund and in terms of trend of investment, where they put in money, and also show that the pension fund where the countries make most return of investment and what is the Korea's pension fund been performing. This is quite important to attract people's attention, and also it is really the way to this pension fund can survive.
Okay, well, I like that idea, sort of like a report card to the public or the pension receiving people, and building that relationship and credibility. Okay. So we've had quite a run talking about the idea of overhauling a pension system for public officials. So any final thoughts wrapping this up?
Yeah, what surprised me is also that the government hasn't proposed a cap on the top retirement income among the public officials, but because there are people high up in the upper echelons of the public service that have very good pensions, and there, of course, there is a kind of symbolic meaning, I think, to introduce some kind of restraint from so those who already are very well off suffer a little bit. It's just a tiny thing for them, but it's important to make that kind of symbolic measures, I think.
This reminds me of the world history where Western countries after the World War II had this kind of discussions where the capitalism, the bad side of it, was clashing with the social unrest and the dissensions. And that area among the scholars is called the embedded liberalism compromise. And the central idea is to make a balance between the growth kind of engine and the impetus to reform, but there has to be a social cohesion to it. And government has to be, at this point, in the middle to kind of bring people in, because that's where the next step will come in, rather than being polarized and limping their way to the progress. We have to be inclusive.
All right, and Mr. Dew?
Well, I think the political will is very important to reform this pension plan, which creates $3.8 billion deficit each year to cover that money with the taxpayers pay. And the bipartisan agreement cooperation, working with the civil servant group to produce a sounding reform, is something that our politicians are accountable and responsible.
All right, so we have things to do. We have homework to do, but finding the middle ground is always difficult. But the way we communicate and approach that is another factor that makes a lot of difference. Thank you so much for coming in, the three of you, and sharing your insights with us. Thank you. And that will do it for this edition of Upfront. But join the conversation and tell us what you think. We are open on our website as well as Twitter. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.